Hello and welcome to this UCL lunch hour lecture on a practical introduction to critical realism. I'm Rob Walker and I'm a research fellow at the IOE Faculty of Education and Society, and I'm going to be chairing today's lecture. And it's my honour to and pleasure to introduce today's speaker, who I know very well from working closely together over the last few years, Priscilla Alderson. Priscilla is Emerita Professor at the IOE. Since 1991, Priscilla has worked at the Social Science Research Unit, now in the Social Research Institute at UCL. Her research covers many aspects of health and education, ethics, childhood, and children's rights, and is reported in over 300 publications. In 2014, she started leading the UCL Critical Realism postdoctoral course, founded by Roy Bhaskar in 2007. Her latest research, published in a series of open access journal papers, is detailed on the UCL website about children's consent to heart surgery. Just before we begin, just some administration to let you know that we'll have some time at the end of the lecture for questions, and you can submit these at any point during the talk by going to the Slido link that you should all have access to. And just remember to enter in the event code, which is #criticalrealism. So that's please give me your questions, write your questions. I'll get to see them throughout the talk, and we'll come back to them at the end through the Slido link. And the event code is #criticalrealism. So I'm now going to hand over to Priscilla, who's sharing her screen for you now. I'm going to go quiet for the next 40 minutes or so, and then we will return for some questions at about 1:45 when Priscilla's finished her talk. Thanks very much. Over to you, Priscilla.
Thanks very much, Rob, and thanks to everyone who's helped to set up this session and who is attending. So, I'm hoping that good. So to start with, critical realism is a philosophy of the natural and social sciences. It's not a research method. In fact, it's useful to use with a whole range of research methods. Many people come across critical realism in the third year of doing their doctoral studies, when they're starting to plan their thesis writing, and that's quite a good time to get to it because it's very useful for analysis. Now, but it's useful at all stages. The most practical start to any research is to sort out the theories. Theories mean ways of seeing the world, and we can see from the long history of social research, which unfortunately for decades was racist, sexist, colonialist, without the researchers having any idea of how narrow their theories were and the need for them to examine them. So, I'm going to start with some examples from my research on consent to children's heart surgery to illustrate the critical realist ideas. I've researched consent to children's heart surgery first in the 1980s for my PhD, and then much more recently with colleagues in 2 London hospitals. In the 1980s, there was a 10% surgical mortality rate. There was only partial success in many cases, and many children lived shorter lives. About 40 years later, amazing. There was an under 1% surgical mortality rate. Operations were far more complex and dangerous, but they had much higher success rates. And there were so many children enjoyed healthy childhoods and could look forward to long-term survival. So when thinking about my social research about consent, maybe I could have looked at the methods that enabled this amazing progress, thanks to scientific research. Much of it was done at UCL Institute of Child Health and at Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital. Primarily, there were great changes to surgery and nursing techniques, with many new operations invented. Then there was the new technology, scans, anesthesia, for testing for heart defects and diagnosing them. There's an amazing electronic patient record system these days that all the documents are collected together in one base to help with research as well as practice. And there's also research on the comparative short and long-term outcomes of surgery to keep testing which operations work best. Now, in 1984, my research question was, can shocked, distressed parents give informed consent to their child's heart surgery? Without the much fetal screening in those days, parents usually learned after the baby was born. It was a great crisis. Could they understand the information? Was it worth distressing them with the details? And was it necessary? Because obviously the baby had to have the life-saving surgery. That was the question. So could I have followed the positivist, realist methods and ideas used in medical research, which deals with facts and certainties, and of course in much social research? They look for demonstrable evidence. There's often measuring and quantifying. Maybe separate variables are sorted out with randomized controlled trials. The aim is to check for certainty and make possibly predictions which we replicated by other studies. Objectivity is taken to mean being value-free and detached. And one primary aim is to inform policy with evidence-based medicine. So with informed consent, I would look for the actual procedures with clear factual information. Maybe I might test patients' understanding of the information, or parents in this case. I was researching parents in the 1980s, and would test different methods of informing and supporting them. The main alternative in social science is, of course, interpretivism and constructivism. And this attends far more to experiences and perceptions, personal accounts and memories, describing the quality of the experience, examining complexity and maybe recording ambiguities, looking at individuals in their varying contexts. Here, objectivity could involve moral relativism. I might see good or bad practices, but it wasn't my place to judge them, just to record them and check their outcomes. There are also links to policy is rather complicated with interpretive research because the findings tend to be less definitive and often smaller and may not be taken so seriously by other experts. So with interpretivism, I might look at people's reported experiences, their needs, their difficulties. And all of this is very important information, but it may be hard to generalize among patients and doctors and dyads. Because, for example, the method that one doctor used to inform parents and patients might work very well with some people, but not at all well for others. So then what do you recommend? This approach of interpretivism involves processes, and so does positivism. Both methods tend to look at how questions rather than at why questions. And the key question for my research was, why does consent matter? Of course, there is the important aim to prevent litigation, but why should you worry very, very distressed, anxious parents with awful details about the surgery with an electric saw slicing open the baby's sternum to start with? So I wanted to look at it from the parent's perspective to see why consent matters. Now, to look at all three different traditions or paradigms, positivism, idealism, and critical realism, you can see that positivism and interpretivism tend to contradict one another. Certainties versus perceptions, evidence versus memories, quantity and quality, and so on. When people patch them together, it can be quite awkward to balance this across the divide of the very different approaches. However, critical realism draws together the very important work done in positivist, realist, and in interpretivist traditions, puts them together and makes a deeper, greater sense of them by seeing that they are two parts of a greater whole, of depth realism, which I'll explain in a minute. So, whereas at the bottom of the table, whereas positivists seek to inform policy, and as I said, interpretivists might have rather tenuous links to policy, critical realism is very keen on connecting policy and practice to critical, often challenging research. So the three domains of depth realism are these three levels. They're all real. They start with the empirical, and then the more real of the actual, and then the most real of all, the real level. And the next slide will begin to explain it in terms of physics. So when you have falling rain, at the empirical level, there are impressions and images of many falling objects. At the actual level, there are specific numbers of raindrops falling in regular or irregular patterns or in constant conjunctions. And yet centuries ago, people might have thought, well, if we look at the rain hard enough and the patterns in the falling, maybe that will explain why and how they're falling. At the real level, the causal mechanisms are shown in their effects. And these are gravity, obviously, and hydraulic cycles. These deep underlying causes are often unseen. Think of the virus, for example, in the recent pandemic. And at this level, this answers the why question. Why does rain fall? Why do pandemics occur? Not just how. Critical realism also reminds us it's very important not to confuse our thinking at the empirical level with the actual independent reality at the actual level. The raindrops are very, very different from our experiences of them, and of gardeners thinking, good, it's raining, or brides thinking, oh no, my day is going to be ruined. The subjectivity of our impressions. With critical realism, at the empirical level, and this is, for example, in relation to consent, there's the thinking and feeling, the explanations, the ideas, descriptions, memories, statistics, perhaps facts, images and perceptions that doctors present to their patients or parents. And there's the explaining and asking questions and discussing options, thinking about them in order to understand informed consent. And this mainly consists of exchanges between doctors and patients in words and images. Next, at the actual level, there is the being and doing, the ontology of consent. These are the events, the relationships, the structures, the actual interactions that take place. And there is the medical condition to be treated, the interventions to correct the heart problem, and the outcomes. So at the actual level, patients really do express their consent or their refusal, and children who may be too young to engage in the consent process may actively cooperate. They understand, they want to have the operation, hoping it will help them, or they resist. The staff may actually enforce treatment on the children, although they cannot do that on adults who refuse. And now at the underlying real level of gravity, these underlying causal mechanisms, they include the policies and economics of healthcare, so that in this country we can expect children to be offered heart surgery, whereas in many countries, unfortunately, they are not. and this owes to the design of the services. There are also the personal motives, hopes and aims of the surgeons and of the patients and parents. And so at the real level, voluntary consent, I am willing to agree, is led by our motives. And these are guided by our needs, emotions and values. And I found through interviewing hundreds of people that their consent involves a journey from fear and doubt, like, you're going to cut my baby open. No, isn't there another way of helping to treat the heart condition? Rejection of the idea often, to then doubt, and then gradually building up trust, hope, confidence in the clinical team, and then getting the courage and commitment to agree to the surgery. And later I interviewed children and young people having surgery, and they went through this same journey. It was vital for them to have time to move through this moral journey in order for them to really give their consent and commitment and cooperation. So practitioners' motives to promote health and high standards are also part of this real underlying method level of reality. That's what drives their work. And of course, their respect and care for patients. Consent itself is about power and control over decisions. And it's the moment when the doctors hand the power over to the parents or patients and say, you decide, we'll wait for your decision. Another thing about critical realism is its attention to facts and values. So with positivism realism, as I mentioned before, objectivity is seen as being value-free. It's all about what is going on, not what ought to happen. Interpretivism is also objective and might include respectful, non-judgmental moral realism, relativism, so that if researchers see surgeons and doctors behaving quite badly and disrespectfully, it's not their place to say anything or comment, they just record and describe. But with critical realism, objectivity involves being fair, but also morally informed, because critical realism recognizes that all social facts are value-laden. Look at the photo, there isn't a person in sight, is there? And yet, don't you think that morality kind of leaps out of the picture and hits you as to what's going on? Not only the rubbish and the danger to wildlife, but the pollution and the plastic that's going on. So critical realism argues that all social facts are value-laden. And with consent, the essence of consent is about truth, respect, justice, rights, moral choice, invisible values. Next on to structure and agency, which is very important and central to critical realism. Now, in some traditions of the social sciences, there are strong structures and fairly weak agents. Your housing or your income really control your life, according to the research. In other research, often the interpretive in-depth interviews, we get the impression of strong agents who draw on background structures to move on their lives. In a third kind of tradition, structure and agency are blurred together, so it's not clear often whether it's the structures that are having the effects or the agents. And actor network theory, for example, blurs structures and agents in that the actants may be conscious human beings, or they may be bags or pens. The bottom line, and I'm sorry if you can't see it properly, but it's got structures and agents with arrows in between them, because critical realism sees the dialectic between the distinctly different structures and the agents working together and interacting. So critical realism sees structure agency interactions as shaping human life and society. Now, structures precede and outlast agents, a hospital, for example, though structures are only enacted through human agency. A hospital only becomes a place of healing when the agents move in, the same with schools as places of learning. And there's continuous interaction between them with social change at all levels of social reality, the empirical, actual, and real. Agency involves meaningful causal power, informed by our own human self-aware intention and purpose. And agency is orientated to and evaluated by future effects. Almost everything we do is about moving towards the future. Of course, we have limited agency. As Marx said, we live in conditions not of our own choosing, and we're thrown into contexts. For instance, when we're born into a family, when we move into a university. Actions can have unintended, counterproductive, unwanted, and unpredicted effects. And often we have the least harmful choice, like the parents deciding, yes, we will have the operation. All the other options are even worse for our baby. So this dialectic of interaction between structure and agency, moving beyond dichotomies into dialectic, is like that between rivers and landscapes. Do rivers shape landscapes, or landscapes shape rivers? Agents are shaped and reshaped by structures, and they reshape the structures constantly through social processes in a dialectic in time and space. Now, I also looked at young people's consent to orthopedic surgery, and one of the most dramatic decisions they would make was about leg lengthening. For very short children, the surgeon will break the bone, insert pins into the edges of the bone on each side with these circular metal contraptions, and they would gradually wind the two apart, and in between, new bone would grow in the gap, up to 6 inches. Now, in the 1980s, their children spent many months in hospital, up to a year, and all the treatment was organised by the practitioners. They were really helpless, these children. However, 40 years later, there'd been a great transfer of agency from the practitioners to the patients and parents. So in the 2020s now, the patients go home a few days after surgery. They or their parents perform the daily distractions, turning the little pins to lengthen the bone. They clean the pin sites and change the bandages. Children administer their own pain relief. This is an agonizing treatment, but it's found that if patients administer their own pain relief, they need less. They keep in contact with the healthcare staff. They take and send x-rays via their mobile phones and emails. And the children exercise and walk to regenerate their bone. They can attend school and lead a virtually normal life. Now, research has helped in this great transfer of attitudes from the power in the hands of the professionals to the power in the hands of the families. And this involved great changes in attitudes, routines, technology, of course, which has enabled long-distance treatment, and values too, to see the patients more as agents in their own right. Margaret Archer is a great protagonist of critical realist work on structure, agency, and culture. And I just put out these pictures of nurses to illustrate how powerfully the three interact, and how the nurses' uniforms denote their status, their work, their relationship with patients. So, for example, in the 1400s, nurses looked like nuns, often were nuns, and one of their main tasks was, sadly, to nurse dying patients who they could not help to recover, and to try to assure them of hope of everlasting life. 400 years later, Charles Dickens' Sarah Gamp was a dissolute, drunken, disorderly nurse. They had a very low reputation, nurses in those days. But then Florence Nightingale reformed nursing. She brought in middle-class women, and they were elegantly and authoritatively dressed. In 1948, the National Health Service opened, and the Queen's dressmaker designed the elegant nurse's uniform. Some of the nurses, though, as you can see with the three in their great headgear, preferred more old-fashioned headwear, and it suggested their formidable power. The nurses really had control over their wards. But 50 years later, the nurses and doctors all wear the same unisex scrubs uniform, showing their busy, intensive work. And you could go into great detail about the interactions between the costumes and the routines and the realities. Another thing is closed systems and open systems. So much positivist research is based on closed systems, particularly with randomized trials trying to construct them. And the method is one of control and prediction to copy the sterile lab conditions. For instance, two single fluids interacting. Randomized controlled trials allocate different groups so that the only difference between them, when they're very evenly randomized with all the variables similar across all the groups, the only difference being the type of treatment given to test what is actually its effect. However, critical realism is much more concerned with open systems. We all live in open systems all the time of countless influences. And one way of analysing these influences is through the critical realist idea of 4 planes of a social being. The first plane is our material relations with nature, our bodies in the natural world. One of my students Kate Martin, was researching young people in psychiatric wards, and she started with bodies, and we thought, is it worth it? They're in there for their minds. However, the study of bodies was so revealing about how they were neglected, how their diet and exercise and physical health were neglected, and how the ward rounds, instead of going from bed to bed in the wards, happened in the doctor's office, away from the patients and their bodies. And this did not help the standards of care at all, and it was really important to analyse that. Plane 2 are the interpersonal subjective relationships we have between individuals and groups. Plane 3 is the broader social relations and inherited structures. And plane 4 is our inner being, our stratified personality. Life is complex, often unpredictable. And it's very helpful to analyse your data using these 4 planes. And many PhD students base their 4 main chapters in their thesis on the 4 planes of social being. It's extremely helpful for analysing and organising your data. Another great advantage of these planes is that even if you only have time to do a small brief study, you can nest it inside reference to much larger data sets, particularly say for stage plane 3, the social relations and inherited structures. So that say you are doing a study of consent surgery, you can look at the structure of and history of the NHS and the way the local, national and supra-regional levels like children's heart surgery are organised and the relationships between them. Inner being is extremely important for looking at the reality and nature of consent, as I described earlier. The final critical realism idea I'm going to share with you today is the 4 stages of transformative change. And they're very useful for analysing any research project and for planning them. Now, the first stage is non-identity, absence. And as particularly ethnographers would say, it's so important to go in with a kind of empty mind as far as you can, to stand back, to suspend your own stereotypes, to try to grasp the reality, the ontology, the local meanings, and the many interacting causal mechanisms. Be open and ready for it all to flow in, and then to try to make sense as much as possible in the terms that the people involved are doing so. So non-identity means don't impose meanings, identities on things. Instead, examine everything very carefully and try to search for the meaning within it. Deep learning. Stage 2 is negativity and power. And this is about recognizing absence, need, suffering, contradiction, missing, absent care. For instance, in the 1980s, when I began to research consent, research ethics and ethics in treatment were not very well organized or much thought of. There wasn't much training about them. Doctors were paternalistic and thought patients should do as I say. So that I had to look at, do we need consent? Does it cause more suffering than it needs, even more suffering? Or is the absence of consent leading to need and suffering and contradiction? Yes, it was. And so then the researcher has to intervene to negate the negations, absent the absences, fill in the missing gaps. Of course, with practical research, sometimes action research, researchers intervene with some intervention, but for most researchers, the actual intervention is to go in and to start collecting your data. Stage 3 is open totality, and that involves observing interventions and their effects in the bigger picture. For instance, looking at the whole person and maybe the family, community, state, the culture, perhaps effects of globalization, the political and economic contexts. Critical realism is so valuable in being able to connect and draw all these different things together to make sense of them. And the fourth stage is praxis, or practical application of findings as far as possible. Publication and promotion of your findings, but also, you hope, self-transformative agency towards freedom, solidarity and justice, so that researchers think, how has research changed me, as well as, we hope, changing the context and the people involved when you collected the data. So it's about movement, change, new self-awareness, about everything working consciously and intentionally for real change. And then researchers, having gained these new insights from all their work, may return to stage 1 with their next project, and using that work, repeat this virtuous cycle. I also suggest that these mini stages happen constantly for every doctor or nurse patient interaction. They go through collecting the evidence, checking the diagnosis, deciding on the treatment, stepping back and looking at the short and long-term outcomes, and then reflecting on what has been learned, and then taking it back to start again with the next patient. Of course, they don't have time to consciously do this every time they see all their hundreds of patients, but overall, I suggest these cycles are happening, and again in our daily lives as well. But there's also a malign version of this process, and that is to ignore stages 1, 3 and 4 and remain stuck at stage 2, the intervention. So we hear, build the wall or stop the boats. It doesn't work, partly because of the lack of exploration and proper gathering of information at stage 1. But when the intervention fails, people stuck at stage 2 simply say, repeat it, do it harder. Now, to do it in the malign stage 2 only way blocks self-awareness, shared consciousness, and work for real change. It offers no new insights or hope of progress as to why people are coming on the boats, or why do they want to cross the space where the wall is. What can be done to help them and to prevent this travel and this suffering, and to find better alternatives, or to see if they really do need to use the boats and to help them with that. So the four-stage process shows how necessary it is to start at number one, stand back and collect knowledge to begin with. Now, Douglas Papora has suggested 7 commitments that all social scientists need to respect. And I'll go through them, and it would be so interesting here from the discussion if you agree with us and whether you think it's possible to do it in every project. So, number one, respect each agent as an embodied centre of conscious experiences, intentions, and motives. That tends to mean working with a limited number of agents and getting to know them. Number two, respect objective human relations and social structures, and think about social structures not as just the built environment, but also as structures of competition, power, inequality, and of working in structure and agency dialectic. Number three, combine intensive micro methods of observations and interviews with extensive or macro methods. And so that can help to increase trust in intensive ethnography, narrative and history, which Papora thinks we should respect more than is often done, and see them as sources of valid causal explanations. And he warns we need to have less trust in statistics and explanations and predictors that often are not all that reliable. On the other hand, the statistics, for instance, of numbers of people in poverty and so on are immensely, immensely important. Number five, meta theory. Be clear and specific about what theories you are using. He says that is central to sociology if it is to be a social science, which means being explicit about your theories. So critical analysis of underlying theories and assumptions in all social research is so important. And these theories might be about the nature of reality and existence, of belief and why we should believe things, of proof and how we know what we're observing, and accuracy, theories of knowledge, perspectives, and theories that underline our choice and use of research methods. Papora argues that theory is much more than hypotheses and definitions. And one of the most important theories that is shaping our research is the question, what must the world be like for this to occur? And again, for example, when you challenge assumptions and theories about racism, sexism, colonialism, that involves thinking, what would a world without racism, beyond colonialism, what would that involve? How would everything have to change? Number six is to recognize truth, not to be relativist. Are social science, relativism, and natural science fallibilism grounds for this general public cynicism, fake news? Because we seem, as social scientists, then to be removing the grounds for validating truth. Papora and critical realists argue there really is a truth at the real level of gravity, an infinite powerful force. And number seven is respecting the inherent values in social facts, so that while objectivity means being fair, open and impartial, it does not mean being neutral or amoral about, for example, injustice and oppression. Now, I'm not going to go through this long list, but it's to demonstrate the interrelated many facets of the problems facing us of the climate crisis, inequalities, financial crises, AI, all of these working together, interacting and influencing one another. So it's impossible really to deal with one alone satisfactorily. And they include social, political, and economic dimensions. So that critical realism, we argue, offers all kinds of theories and frameworks that help people from many different disciplines work together, trust one another, complement each other's work, enrich and illuminate it. And the point is to change it. So critical realism, critical comes from the tradition of the Marxist research. We aim to work together for a normative order informed by the values of trust, solidarity, sensitivity to suffering, nurturing and care, and universal reciprocally recognized rights, freedoms and duties. That's the notice about my book, which, although it's about health and illness, is actually, all the ideas in it can be applied to any kind of research. And as the pandemic showed us, health and illness actually affect every aspect of our lives, don't they? If you order it from Policy Press, you can get 50% discount as long as you use the code BUP23. Also, Rob and I conducted a 10-part introductory teaching series on critical realism, which is on YouTube. There's some references. I'm happy to send the PowerPoint to anyone who would like them. And thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Priscilla. That was a really fascinating talk. And despite the fact that you and I have taught lots of these concepts together on the course, it was it still got me thinking. You've still developed my thinking, and I think that just shows how, when we engage with critical realism, we're engaging with real complexity, and there's always much to be learned. And I just want to just go back over a couple of things that you said before turning to the questions. And something that I thought that really struck me, and I thought was particularly profound, was that you pointed out how disaggregating the empirical from the actual and the real in looking at consent to surgery, you ended up with this vastly complex ontology that resulted in consent, or is related to consent. And just the three things that were in the midst of there were trust, hope, and courage. And I thought that was it was a brilliant reminder that often those are the kind of things that get overlooked in social science research, which perhaps it means that my next question has been slightly led, but I just wondered if you'd answer one of the questions that you posed to yourself, which is, you said just now, you said could I have followed a positivist or realist approach to research consent to heart surgery? And I just wanted to ask you, what might have happened had you followed one of those approaches rather than followed a critical realist approach?
Yes, well, mainly the positive one is that they're conducted by psychologists to measure, aren't they, people's reactions. And I was very new to sociology at the time. And by the way, I hadn't heard of critical realism till many years later. And it was a revelation to come across critical realism. It explained a lot of where I've been feeling towards. It would have illuminated and supported it immensely at the time. And since then, doing further research on consent, it has been so useful. So my first PhD supervisor wanted me to do a very interpretive method of moral accounts, and to listen to the parents and the doctors, or mainly the parents, and how they presented themselves as a good parent in interviews to me. But that would not have helped me research consent, because research to consent is based on the relationship of trust and mutual respect between the doctor and patient or parent. This relationship is essential, whereas the moral accounts are all very isolated and they look at the person's interview with the researcher. So I had to change supervisors, so that was quite complicated and difficult. And I think I was often working in the dark, and critical realism would have enormously helped me. I'm sorry, my camera's gone. I'll try and fix it, Rob.
Okay, well that's fine. Well, we're just in the questions, so I'll fire a few more questions towards you, Wally, if you can do the two together. No, that's yeah, no, it's really, and I think it's helpful for you to say, particularly as there may be people who are studying for PhDs at the moment, talking about difficulties around, you know, the sort of nightmare scenario of having to switch supervisor, which you obviously managed with, you know, there were obviously some difficulties, but got through it. So, you know, I hope that people find some solace in that if they are encountering difficulties in their PhD. Priscilla, I'm going to just jump into one very, very, very broad question, which is from someone here, and I'm afraid I haven't got people's names. They're just listed as anonymous, so I'm sorry that I'm not giving your names out. But the question is, what are the key differences between critical realism and critical theory?
I'm so sorry about my camera. I'll give up on that and try to concentrate on the question. I do apologise. Critical theory is mainly the Marxist tradition of trying to change the world, and it mainly uses the positivist and interpretivist methods and approaches I explained, plus the critical aspect. Whereas critical realism has new approaches to what is real, what is in our thinking, our epistemology, and what is the independent existing world ontology that we're studying. And also critical realism, of course, has got books and books of ideas and theories, and it's got this wonderful huge dictionary by Mervyn Hartwig as well, that goes into immense detail about the many, many theories that will help you. However, just to remind you that I showed the ladder at the beginning, and I do suggest that anyone starting critical realism, and also I have in mind very busy PhD supervisors who have a student who wants to use critical realism but themselves haven't used it. I do hope this will be a helpful basic introduction. That the difference is to start with just a few of the most basic critical realist theories and work thoroughly with them, rather than feeling you've got to introduce a whole lot of them.
Great, thanks very much. And just to reiterate on that the question there as well with critical realism and critical theory, I think with oh great, you're back, Priscilla. As I was saying, I think the thing to think about with that distinction from Priscilla's slides was the slide that distinguished between the empirical, the actual, and the real, where you're really focusing on what is real. And I certainly found when I encountered critical realism, having often felt quite at sea dealing with a more kind of traditional critical approach. With critical realism, you can suddenly feel grounded because you're dealing with reality. You're not just kind of in the void, so to speak. And also, just as Priscilla was saying, the dictionary of critical realism, because you're dealing with an understanding of the world structured in a slightly different way, there is a slightly different language to learn. And so, I mean, even though I've been working critical realism for a few years now, I had that sitting on my desk because you still have to turn to it often, and it's a very important resource. So don't feel lost because you don't understand every sentence that you read in the Journal of Critical Realism. We all struggle, and we all have to go back to the dictionary and find our way. So next question for you, Priscilla, is again, I think this is going to be a very broad answer, but which qualitative methods of analysis does critical realism work best with?
Again, back to near my beginning, critical realism is so much theory rather than method. So I think the best method is the one that best suits you, that you're most happy and comfortable with, and also, of course, the best method for answering the questions for your specific research, and then adapting critical realism to that.
Right, yeah. And I think it's also probably worth pointing out that when at the annual Critical Realism conference, there are all sorts of different methods. Almost any method you can imagine is present there. It is a very broad church, to use that analogy. The next one, sorry, go on.
Some people do use actor network theory and critical realism. So again, critical realists disagree with each other as well, of course, about so.
And also, I think you can. I mean, something that Roy Bhaskar, the founder of critical realism, wrote was that all good science and social science has always been critical realist. So if you are using different approaches, you may read other research and think, well, these people have gone into a depth ontology, they've gone deep into what is real, and that may well be critical realist without it being called critical realist. It's not something that has to be kind of shouted about necessarily.
Yes, I did research for about 30 years before I came across critical realism, and it was just so helpful to feel what I've been working towards, often feeling rather in the dark, was waiting there. Another thing is that Douglas Purpura, whose 7 Commitments I ended with, says there's much good research, but often critical realism could make it even better.
Yeah. So I'm going to on to another question, and I sort of hesitate to say this one, Priscilla. So, but I think this will lead to an interesting interesting response, I'm sure. I'm conducting a systematic review. How could I justify I am a critical realist for this research method?
Yes, and the systematic reviews are very much influenced by Ray Pawson, who said that his work on realism and realist evaluation was influenced at first by Roy Bhaskar, but then later he had rather a falling out with critical realists. And for example, one big difference is that Ray Pawson says that his work is value-free. That's one example. But that doesn't mean everyone doing systematic reviews has to be value-free. And quite a lot of people do combine critical realism and realist evaluation. And that becomes very evident in the Journal of Critical Realism, which is really worth looking at. There are 5 issues a year, I think, and it's shot up in the citation index. And it's full of the great variety of different methods being used. And I wouldn't be surprised if somebody doing systematic reviews has written in the journal. I also suggest that Dave Elder Vass runs a network on critical realism, and you could send an inquiry to find out if get in touch with other people around the world combining critical realism and systematic reviews. That's another thing. And I think also on the Ramesses network for realists, critical realism often pops up, and again it's worth inquiring there about people who are combining the 2 methods.
And just to add to that, I think possibly the question to ask from a critical realist perspective of the systematic review that you're doing is, what is the real that you're looking at? Because are you looking at real people and the real world, or are you looking at the real structures that have constructed the documents that you're reading? And those are 2 different questions, or 2 different answers. Another question for you, Priscilla. I'll just rattle on because we've got quite a few and not much time. In the table, it says, so I think that's one of the tables in your slides. In the table, it says, interpretivism or constructivism's links to policy are complicated compared to critical realism. Could you explain?
Yes, well, unfortunately, I think nearly all sociology has a complicated relationship with policy. For instance, we saw in the pandemic, there were a range of scientists used along with the policymakers, but sociology was deafeningly silent, wasn't it, during the pandemic? I think this is a great tragedy of sociology, and we should be working much more on how to make sociology relevant, appealing, and direct to the public opinion and to policymakers. And I think critical realism is very valuable in that because of our interest in realism and being anchored in people's real troubles and solutions in their life and so on. And that's just the beginning of a long discussion.
Thanks very much. Sorry, I'm just scanning through some of the questions. This is quite a good question here. Is critical realism interpreted differently depending on the discipline the researcher is working in, or can it only be used in a sociological, maybe that's as a sociological paradigm?
No, it's definitely interdisciplinary. As I tried to show, you can use it in physics or politics, economics, and indeed there are a whole range of critical realists. Loads of economists are working on critical realism. It's just theories that are at the sort of heart and basis of all kinds of research methods and topics. Yeah. And also combining them too.
Right. Yeah. And I think going back to that idea of the broad church, it does welcome in all these different methods and just in many ways just deepens them. So this is a question. This is quite a specific question, which if I'm comparing one type of treatment to the other, and we might not be able to answer this, but because we haven't got enough details, but we'll give it a go. If I'm comparing one type of treatment to the other, what is the empirical, actual, and reality of this?
Ah, yes. Well, there probably has been a whole range of different kinds of research. So you will have the surgeon, say it's surgery, having to produce their short and long-term outcomes of their operations, positivist research. You may have nurses who've researched how the intensive nursing and support, the physical and the psychological care affect patients' outcomes, the whole range of that. There may well be research with patients on their experiences, their doubts and worries, their problems before the treatment, what they wanted and needed to be treated and alleviated, and their views on the outcomes, so that you'll be looking at a whole range of different people, policymakers, funders, hospital managers, looking at different aspects, the cost effectiveness of treatments, for example, and also how patients evaluate short and long-term outcomes in different ways. Did it enable you to live a normal life? Were you deeply thankful you were free of pain, even though you were restricted? All of these range of both subjective and practical experiences.
Thanks very much.
Again, we could talk about that very interesting question for a long time.
I'm going to finish off with one final question, which is slightly left field, but I think it just, if we could just answer it quite quickly, it's going to wrap up in about a minute and a half. But there's a question here. It says, in relation to consent, has consent to research gone too far, creating huge barriers?
This is so interesting because I was involved with medical ethics in the 1980s and involved in the transfer of standards from medical ethics into social research, because social research was lagging so much behind. And it wasn't until this century, 2002, that the British Sociological Association required everyone to send their protocols to research ethics committees, and lots of people still do not do so. And there's the argument that, of course, the medics have to be very careful because they can kill and injure people, but social research doesn't hurt people. It does. It can humiliate, confuse people, it can disrupt their lives, and bad reports, misleading reports, can inform completely the wrong policies or lead to very great dangers and needs being neglected. So social research has huge ethical implications. And just as a quick answer, the fourth version of my book with Virginia Morrow on the ethics of research with children and young people, but it all applies to adults as well, came out in 2020. and is in the UCL library, if that's any help. And we go through the 10 stages of a research project, from first plans to final dissemination. And we look at the ethical questions raised at each of these stages. And consent, I think sociologists really do need to respect consent very, very much highly. Otherwise, how can they hope to get people's trust and the best responses for them?
Great. I think that's a really
But
lovely.
I would like to say I do think research ethics committees are going over the top in some ways and losing their efficiency and effectiveness, and this is very sad.
Great. Sorry, let you get that bit in for balance at the end. But also that was a lovely place to finish, because it brought us right back to the heart of your actual work, which was a great place to finish. So I think that was really thankful for you for giving us your insights into your extensive work, and also thankful for all of the work that you've done over the last few decades, clearly improving many people's lives. So thank you very much for that as well. I think we'll call it a day there. So thank you very much, Priscilla. Thank you very much, Case and Diana, for organising this, and thank you very much for all of the questions. That was a great session, and really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, and Kate and Diana, and thank you to everyone who's attended. Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.